Hello all, welcome to our final installment, the conclusion of Psych of Motivation. Uh, it was cool hanging with you when we were able to do so. It's been a little stranger, I must admit, since then. But I hope that we've gone through it successfully, and I hope that you all perceive that you got the value for your educational dollar under these unusual circumstances. I know that so many of your teachers have really done their best in trying to make this happen for you. And you know, the university, the business aspect of the university and safety has done their best to keep us all safe. So let's hope that we've accomplished those goals. Here's a little picture of Montana and baby mama, if you will. I believe that's baby mama. Notice on Kitty City, that's not a lot different than Hannah. Back up here on Kitty City. I don't know if you can see her. Right, Hannah? Yeah. Okay, Hannah. So let's get busy here. Let's close it out. Let's offer the conclusion, and really this is intended to kind of tie almost all the concepts that we've talked about into some kind of logical manner. Not all, but that would be probably too lofty in the few slides that we have here ahead of us. But hopefully provides an overview, a nice system of concluding the course. So understanding and applying motivation, which is what we've been about now for this semester, there's been basically three objectives. We've hoped to explain, and that is, why do people do what they do? And remember, that was one of the core questions of motivation. Why do they do what they do, and why does it vary in its intensity? Right? So we seek to explain, that is, and how many of you people, how many folks are people watchers, right? I'll profess, I'm a big-time people watcher. One of the things that led me to study social psychology is not being able to leave the question alone. I observe behavior and I ask, why on earth did they do that? Right? And so that's, you know, kind of what inspires the quest to understand motivation, right? So I want to explain, why do people do what they do? And if I'm able to explain, and this is very much Fritz Heider, we want to explain people's behavior so we can ultimately predict people's behavior and diminish the uncertainty in our existence. So the predict is how conditions will affect motivation and emotion, and that's to understand the nuances. And then apply it. We want to be able to use it. So we want to, you know, understand motivational principles to solve practical problems. So we can explain, predict, and apply, and that's kind of what this course has been about. You notice the big assignment in regulatory styles is very much what this is about. So explaining motivation, what do? Well, motivation theories come to the rescue. And we saw that instinct theories explained almost nothing, so they were abandoned. And most of the grand theories were abandoned. And we remember that the rise of the mini theories, or mid-range theories, however you want to label those, were empirically testable, and then we could provide conclusions that had empirical evidence to support them. So now we have myriad motivational theories, but it allows us to explain essentially two things. Reason for behavior. Why do we do what we do? Why do we want what we want, right? Because we found that wants often present themselves as quasi-needs, which have a strong motivational component. So why do we do what we do, and why do we want what we want, right? And that then should be, in essence, a good portion of the reasons for our observed behavior. And then we also use motivational theories to explain motivational states. How motives might be intensified, how they change, how they might fade. And again, this is a huge part of the application process. How can we use what we've learned to better our existence and better the performance within our organizations? There have been two kind of ideas behind that. So the framework to understand the study of motivation, as we've been pushing through, is what comes first. And antecedent conditions is the fancy way to say that. What's the setup, right? What's the situation? What's going on, right? And then how does the setup, the situation, the context, affect motive status, right? And motive status can be expressed in terms of needs, as we've described, right? We've talked in terms of needs. We've also talked in terms of cognitions and emotions. And notice needs we're using as a relatively general category here that might include things like also drives, motivations, etc. So the antecedent condition helps us to understand where the motive status came from and how it exists. Then we look at the sense of the motive status wanting to, and often this is expressed in a simple approach or avoid a stimulus object, right? Or a given situation. And then finally, energizing and directing, and this is what motivation is. It energizes and directs behavior as part of our definition, right? So energizing and directing behavior, engagement, the physiology, and the self-report of such. Right? So these are all components then in the big picture of motivation. Predicting motivation, identifying the antecedents, well, which antecedent conditions energize and direct behavior? And we have a selection when we look at antecedents, when we look at context. What are the aspects of the environment? And notice, to understand what we observe, we might have to combine our knowledge of all these antecedents in given situations. That is, what is the environmental component? What was the interpersonal component? That is, between people in this regard. What's the intrapsychic component? That is, within the person, what is their nature, right? Their motivational state, their self-regulatory style, all these components. And then there might be physiological, like a hunger drive that is an antecedent as well. And remember, if we combine these, we saw the research on eating ice cream, and we saw that people consumed more ice cream. When? Well, they consumed more ice cream when there were more choices available. So if there's a variety available, then that's an environmental condition, right? And remember, the other independent variable in that study was, are there people around? And we said, oh, the more people around, the more they ate. Right? The intrapsychic wasn't necessarily tested in that experiment, but we might say, to what extent does this person like ice cream or not? Right? And that is the intrapsychic kind of component. And physiological, then we might in hunger versus being not hungry. Right? So all of those then could be used as information to help us explain and predict what we observe in terms of the ice cream eating behavior and the subsequent feelings about having eaten the ice cream. So, applying motivation to solving problems then, two questions. How do I motivate myself? How do I motivate others? We've had exercises in this class that talk about things that you do freely with basically no effort to motivate yourself to do it, things that you engage in intrinsically without thinking, other things you have to force yourself to do. And we've asked the question a couple times, what's the difference, right? To come to understand us. How to, also the Dr. Reese's book, The Assignment, on the 16, goals, motivation, etc. Those are components. What's important to me and what's less important to me. And then we took on the task of how to motivate others, and that was in the first paper, right? In assessing someone's self-regulatory style, and how do we craft interventions that are consistent with that style to increase their motivation. And notice, though, the caveat was that we're not likely to take someone who's extrinsically motivated and turn around tomorrow and make them intrinsically motivated. What we're more likely to do is increment them along gradually. In violation of my rule number 2, you can't change people. You can create space where they might change themselves is probably a safer way to go with that, right? Solving motivational problems, what do? We tend to amplify strengths, and that's a good approach to take. Hey, what do I like to do already, right? What are my strengths? What are my capabilities? And build on those, right? And thus improve in functioning as a result of this. Now, the other aspect is maybe addressing some of the weaknesses, that is repairing weaknesses and overcoming pathology. So it really is, what are my strengths, and let me capitalize on those. What are my weaknesses, and see how I can begin to mitigate or minimize those. And as that distance increases, we see that performance increases as a result. So to motivate the self, resource for motivating the self, lifelong development, right, of inner motivational resources. And I hope that one of the goals in this class was to come away understanding your relationship with motivation in yourself. What motivates me, what tends to demotivate me, what do I find attractive, what do I find unattractive, how can I even begin to do the unattractive things that I need to do, right? So nurturing that kind of inner source of motivation, taking command of it, understanding how self-efficacy, one's sense of competence, one's self-esteem feed into these ideas. The environmental conditions, this is where we select and where we choose wisely. Let's choose environments that prompt our success and avoid environments and environmental circumstances that tend to diminish our success or sap our motivation. So we need to take control. And then the resource for motivating others works two ways. To what extent do I hang out with people who nurture my own motivational qualities, and to what extent am I finding people to whom I can contribute and help them with their motivational issues? To whom can I be a resource, and who can be a resource to me? And I think it's important to operate in both of those frameworks. Based on these three elements, the resource, the environmental, for motivating self and motivating others, we can see that affects motive status, both in ourselves and others. Ultimately, though, the goal, right, the end game is increased performance, right, increased engagement, more approach behaviors, diminishing avoidant behaviors, and increasing approach behaviors, and thus hopefully then increasing our sense of well-being, our self-confidence, and a more enriched and powerful self-view, if you will. So motivating the self, nurture those inner resources, right, and growing. To the extent, understand that your cognitions, your needs, your emotions, are they approach-oriented or are they avoidance-oriented? And to what extent? I mean, the first step in that is awareness, right? And say, hey, you know, I'm really operating in an approach manner in this context. In another context, I say, you know, I seem to be, you know, looking at avoidance. And you can trace that back, because remember, this ties to mastery goals or performance goals. And mastery goals, to the extent that we adopt and explore mastery goals, then put us in an approach state. And to the extent that we keep ourselves wedded to numerical kind of performance goals, then we often enter into an avoidance state, that is, to avoid failure rather than approach success. So ultimately, out of this, as we gain awareness and we practice with this and we use ourselves as our own experimental lab rats, so to speak, right? Hypothesize about our behavior, put our behavior to the test and measure the results, right? We can experience strong, resilient, and productive motivational states to a greater and greater extent. Now, to expect to just, you know, leave the class and have this all be taken care of probably ain't in the price of admission. But to learn some of the skills to build on for the rest of our lives becomes part of the goal, I would say. Now, to motivate others, who is motivating the person, we can ask. What is motivating the person? The questions. Is the person motivated by the person themselves? Are we looking at someone who's got a high level of intrinsic motivation? They're, you know, at the high end of self-regulation, or are they pretty much manipulated? Poor word. I don't want to use the word motivated. Impelled, I guess, by outside forces. And those would be the people who are extrinsically motivated. And to the extent that outside forces don't work at all, right, then we look at those poor folk who are in the state of amotivation. So to motivate others, is the social context supporting the person's you know, personal causation and inner motivational resources? One of the things we do as leaders, one of the things we do as parents, one of the things that we do for others, our partners, is to create a space in which they operate. So we contribute to their life space. Are you creating a space that nurtures their motivational resources, or maybe not so much? So if you're a partner in a relationship, are you providing support, or are you providing responses and behaviors that undermine the other person? Right? Who do you want to be, and how do you want to operate in this regard? The primary goal here is enhancing the other's capacity for personal causation. Right? That is, that they view themselves as a causal mechanism in their own life. So their PLOC, their perceived locus of causality is becoming more and more internalized. They're becoming the master of their own fate. So to what extent do we help a person achieve that rather than necessarily do something for them that can rob them of that sense of intrapersonal causality? Right? So, and let's, in the next slide, I want to contrast that with producing compliance, right, or a pattern of desired behavior. And we're going to borrow from Elliot Aronson here. So where is he? There's Elliot. And he talks about 3 responses to social influence, or how we influence others, if you will. And I can enforce compliance with my children. You know, I can say, you need to do this or you're going to get a spanking. You need to do this if you want to earn your allowance. And basically what I'm doing is I'm demonstrating coercive power at this point. I have power over this person, so I'm a boss, I'm a parent, I'm a teacher, what have you. And if I operate in this idea, what I'm doing is manipulating their environment in terms of rewards and punishments. And, you know, this is often what we need to do with toddlers. Toddlers are not good at understanding long explanations, you know, and often to gain a toddler's compliance, which is all we're seeking, is to get them to do this right now, is suggest a punishment or suggest a reward and hope that the hope that the reward wins the day. The problem with this technique is that the person learns little. They already know what they like or don't like in terms of punishment or reward. And they don't really develop any kind of personal locus of causality out of this. They're responding to an external source. So it's a very extrinsic method of getting this done if we want to pool all those concepts together. Right? So this would be kind of at the lowest level of our self-regulatory continuum. Another problem with this is then it ties us to that person. We are locked to them because we have to be there to supply the rewards or punishments, or we have no power. So coercive power is kind of like the lowest level of power. I mean, it can be a fierce level of power, but it really causes us to be tied to the person we're trying to essentially, and I think the term is fair in this case, the person we're trying to manipulate, because that's what we're trying to do. Now, let's talk about moving a step up to this idea of identification. And now I present myself in an attractive manner. So this is really me presenting myself as an attractive example to aspire to, right? To which to aspire, right? So in this case, I'm saying, hey, do this, because if you do this, then you'll be like me, and that'll be awesome, and that'll be a bitchin', and that'll be really cool for you, right? So we operate it like that. Now, I can influence people to do a great deal through my attractiveness as long as they continue to see me as attractive. But the moment that I lose my attractiveness, then I lose my power. So identification is at a higher level. And notice on the self-regulatory continuum, if we look at identified regulation and introjected regulation, we're probably operating in this area if we want to tie those concepts together. Another term for this is referent power. Right? And my grandfather, when I was a child, could get me to do anything. He could get me to do absolutely anything. Why could he? Because I loved my grandfather and I thought he was the most amazing person on the planet. I mean, on the one hand, he was a plumber. On the other hand, he was an electrician. He was a carpenter. There's nothing he couldn't build. I mean, we built a dark room for me underneath my mom's condominium. Anything Grandpa asked me to do, I would do, because his attractiveness and my desire to be like him was overwhelming. Right? And that works until, God forbid, he no longer becomes attractive to me. Notice the advertisement for Nike way back in the day. Michael Jordan, right? I want to be like Mike. I want to be like Mike. I want to be like Mike. Mike is this phenomenal athlete. Kids want to be like him, so they buy the shoes. And that's the deal. Air Jordans, whatever form of shoe. It's powerful, but it isn't as powerful as internalization. And now notice, when we internalize the message, the value system, then we want to do right, we want to do the right thing, we want to do what we believe is the expert thing. So people who present themselves with credibility and they provide us suggestions on how to live more successfully or how to get things done. And we can see that they've done them themselves, that they lead by example, if you will, right? That they're expert in this matter and their expertise is kind of irrefutable. These people then stand out, and this is the most effective way to motivate someone. Notice we're not at a level of compliance, anything but. We're saying, hey, this is the thing to do because, and this is why. Right? And let me show you the data surrounding it. And we see that through this person by the way they live, that in fact, and this is the most distant from hypocrisy, if you will, which is a common thing that we observe in this day and age, probably any day and age, right? The nice thing about internalization, once people internalize the ideas, then you don't need to be there anymore because now they've become internalized, right? And people are at this point kind of self-starters, self-governors, self-evaluators, and they have a high degree of perceived locus of causality. That is, that they are highly internalized in this regard. Then they can become intrinsically motivated to do this thing, these things at this point. So 3 levels of compliance. Note that the most internalized is obviously the one labeled internalization. So let's break here and then we'll come back for the second half.